If you're struggling with creating immersive descriptions in your tabletop role-playing games, there's a little secret that will take the pressure off you as a game master. And that's details don't actually matter as much as we think they do. Because we're constantly describing things that don't exist in real time, we have a tendency to treat our players' imagination like a blank canvas. And the more detail we add onto this blank canvas, the more we feel like we're doing a good job in immersing our players in the situation. But part of the problem is this. The moment we add details to something, we're actually telling our players to pay attention to this thing. And if you're doing that 90% of the time, you're overloading your players with details that aren't really that important. There's 4 simple shortcuts that I use that really bypass the fluff and get my players immersed instantly. I call this the slip test. First is trigger one of the 5 senses. Second is to create like associations. Third is being intentional with what gets details. And the fourth one is layering details progressively, whether we know it or not. There's 3 mindsets that we encounter that really set us up for failure rather than success. First one is that we have a tendency to over-elaborate because we feel it's immersing our players in the game. The second one that I've noticed is that when we're describing things, we actually have a tendency to over-elaborate because we're trying to improvise something that doesn't exist. The players talk to an NPC that we didn't plan for, they go into the room that we didn't set up. We have a tendency to compensate by over-describing things to make it work. But the third mindset is really what kind of gets us stuck, and that's we compensate with over-descriptions because we want our players to see what we see, and that's just not going to happen ever. If I said you entered a room and there was a circular table carved from a massive oak tree, inlaid with intricate gold trimmings around the edges, polished to a glossy sheen, you have a better picture of the table that I'm thinking of in my mind. However, regardless of that detail, I guarantee you one thing, we are not thinking of the same table. The more important thing to pay attention to is how fast your mind actually filled in the details. Because the most powerful weapon that we have in our toolkit as dungeon masters, it's actually our players' imagination. In fact, all the minis, all the maps, all the props, and everything that we bring to the table are all meant to fuel and to trigger our players' imagination. So immersing our players into the game isn't so much about how detailed we can be, but more importantly, how efficient we are at getting them to focus on what's important. And this is where the slip test comes into play. We're going to imagine that you are approaching an ominous obelisk. Most basic thing is that we say, you see a giant obelisk. That's what we default to, and it's super effective, but we can also trigger our players' emotion, mood, and feeling just as well with all the other senses. For example, as you approach, the acrid smell of brimstone emanates from this obelisk. As you approach, it gives off a searing heat that prevents you from moving further. Or as you approach, you hear nothing. A deafening silence overtakes the immediate vicinity around this obelisk. The second thing that we can do to really engage our players is to create like association. It's really hard for us to imagine things that don't exist. Creating associations with things that our people are familiar with helps them understand and make that abstract thing more concrete. The key is using things that are familiar. If you're drawing connections to things that your players are not familiar with, it's going to backfire on you. Using a like comparison gives your players an anchor and a common association to latch onto. For example, as you approach, the obelisk is black like a midnight sky flecked with starlight. The third thing that we can do is being intentional with details. Remember this, you will draw attention to whatever you're adding details to. As you approach this black obelisk, gold veins begin to sprawl around it, culminating at a gaping hole at the very top. The fourth thing that we can do is be progressive with our descriptions. Now, with describing things progressively, it's like adding salt to your meal. You can always add a little dash here and there, and that will give it more flavor, versus dumping a bunch of salt and ruining the entire experience. The same thing happens with NPCs. The tendency for us with NPCs is that we will describe everything about them, their look, their hair color, their limp, the way they sound, the way they smell. We're going to front load those things because we want this particular NPC to be so clear in our player's mind. But what really good authors do is actually to give you enough description to have a vague idea of who this person is. And as you progress through your encounters, you're adding more detail and nuance to the character. And that actually makes your descriptions richer because it becomes a discovery as the players interact with this particular NPC or object in the environment. The question is, how much is too much actually? Remember, our brains can only hold so much information, and you don't want to keep overloading them with fluff, especially if they're going to ignore it. Think about a good YouTube hook. You have about 5 seconds to grab your audience's attention before they start tuning out. The same thing kind of happens with us. We only have a very short window of time in order to grab our players' attentions and get them going again. Again, it's better to add as we go along versus front-loading our players with so much information which 3 seconds later is gone from their minds. Now, if you really want to bring your players specifically to a certain look, then a good visual is going to quickly get everybody on the same page. When I was running my games on a virtual tabletop, I would always have a scene that depicted where my players were going to traverse. And those scenes would be like establishing shots in the movie. It gives the viewers a context or a setting for where the action is going to take place. In the case of an NPC or a monster, visuals really help you flesh out those characters' details, but you still have to do the work in order to bring them to life. So if there's anything that you can take away from this, it's this. Don't sweat your description. Start by triggering their senses. Go beyond just using sight. Start using the other 4 senses. You're going to see a change in how fast it's actually going to bring your players in. Second thing that you can do is create like associations. Third thing you can do is really be intentional with what gets the details. You don't need to do the heavy lifting with your descriptions. In fact, the more vague you are, the more your players' minds are going to fill in those blanks and really dial in the details for you. And the fourth thing that you can do is be progressive with your descriptions. The closer you are to the object, the more you can start layering on the descriptions. Hope you found that helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.